Hello, my name is Jade Spence and I'll be giving a presentation on a given case study. The stance on this presentation is that administering person-centered care and compassionate verbal and non-verbal communication with respect to the grief and loss frameworks can aid nurses in providing therapeutic care to elderly patients suffering from a loss. I will discuss the verbal and non-verbal communication in relation to inter- and intrapersonal barriers and effective strategies for therapeutic communication. Person and family-centered care will be explored to show the importance of empathy and understanding towards patients. This will then link to the grief and loss frameworks and how these can help us to understand patients. A SOAP note and an SBAR handover example will be provided to show effective ways to handle patient care. And finally, I will outline the importance of self-care in a healthcare setting. Verbal communication is the words that are expressed without consideration of how they are expressed, although the way the words are said have an effect on how they are interpreted. Therefore, miscommunication can result from misinterpreted nonverbal communication. Nonverbal communication is categorized as vocal and nonvocal. Vocal communication is stated as being present in the tone, speed, and pitch of spoken words. Similarly, volume is another vocal communicator. The first example of this is the daily repetition of the phrase, "When can I go back home?" which nonverbally communicates distress and the insistent desire to return home. By acknowledging this, you can give constructive praise and link it back to the need for continued care. For example, you could say, "Wow, you're really improving. Just imagine how much better you'll be after a month here." This links the improvement to the care they are being administered and reaffirms their need for continued care. Also, the volume of the student nurse when addressing the patient is loud, which can communicate aggression towards the patient as it comes across as intimidating. The son demonstrates this also in response. The non-vocal, non-verbal cues are external factors that relate to communication. Firstly, when the student nurse is leaning over Helena, this shows a communication form called proxemics, which could be interpreted as threatening. The son in response comes closer to the student nurse after using proxemics, and moreover demonstrates synchrony by mimicking the nurse's actions. This is most likely to reveal to the nurse how rude she was being. Due to the misinterpretations of non-verbal communication, inter- and intrapersonal barriers can be created. Intrapersonal or psychological barriers can stem from assumptions and differing expectations, which we can see in the case study via the student nurse's perception that she could attend to the call alone, Helena's grief of the loss of her husband and home, Helena's assumption that she could go home, the differing expectation of the student nurse, therefore perceiving that the student nurse is rude, which stems from the non-verbal communication used to address Helena, the student nurse's belief that Helena had a hearing deficit, which was caused by the lack of knowledge and confusing two different patients. Interpersonal barriers are the barriers that arise between people, which is shown by the conflict between the nurse and the patient's family, caused by the perceived aggression that the nurse showed towards Helena when speaking. Also, the differences in culture, the variation in ethnicity, as well as the healthcare culture of the aged care setting. To avoid miscommunication, there are several nonverbal strategies that you can use. Goleman's view for effective communicators is comprised of 5 key aspects: self-awareness, self-control, motivation, empathy, and social skills that all work together to communicate effectively. A helpful strategy for effective communication is active listening, which is shown and practiced through the use of visual contact, oculesics, vocal qualities such as pitch, tone, speed, and volume, verbal tracking using paraphrasing and watching for macro and micro topics, and body language, posture, kinetics, proxemics, and haptics. Person and family-centered care. Person and family-centered care aims to give a holistic care to patients and aims to build around the needs and preferences of the individual. This means understanding them at a personal level, needing to use empathy. Jiyoung Kim defines empathy as the ability to understand another person's emotions and circumstances, thereby fostering communication. But a person is made up of many different aspects. These aspects to consider of an individual are age, gender, ethnicity, culture, experiences, etc. Culture is a distinction between groups that is influenced by our daily lives. Having immigrated to Australia in the 1950s and only living in the house her husband built, Helena's sense of home and belonging is tied to her house and her husband, both of which she has recently lost. To properly show person-centered care, we must also understand where they are emotionally. Therefore, we must understand grief, loss, bereavement, and crisis, because most aged care residents are experiencing losses or have experienced losses that continue to affect them. Bereavement. Bereavement is the loss of someone significant or loved through death, which we can see in Helena's case through the death of her husband. We can understand grief better by using the FWHL strategy, asking ourselves, what do we know? What do we need to know? How will we find this information? And what have we learnt in regards to grief, bereavement, and loss? Crisis. Crisis is a disruption of psychological homeostasis in which one's usual coping mechanisms fail, and there exists evidence of distress and functional impairment. We need to know what crisis is so we can better understand and address the crisis that Helena is dealing with. Crisis can lead to feelings of uncertainty and isolation. In the case of Helena, the isolation she feels from the death of her husband is furthered by having to move to an aged care facility. SOAP notes. SOAP notes are legal documents that record the progress of a patient and aid in the continuity of care. Subjectively, we assess what is said and the feelings of the patient or patient's family. For example, when Helena said that she was told she could go home. Objectively, we record what we observe in relation to the patient's claim. Helena wasn't told she could go home, but instead was praised for her self-care. The assessment combines the two and comes to a conclusion. Due to her desire to return home, she misinterpreted the praise. When a plan of action is given, Helena should be given more informational and emotional support. SBI handover. SBI handover also aids in the continuity of care and is a verbal handover. Putting myself into the situation, the SBI handover would go thusly. Helena Gersick, an 86-year-old female, has made the assumption that she can go home. Addressing this was handled ineffectively and led to a conflict involving the patient's family. She was moved to the facility after being deemed unfit to self-care unsupervised. She has been asking daily when she can return home. The patient is bereaved of her late husband of 7 months and is in a state of crisis. She is able to perform basic caring tasks but is struggling to accept being at the aged care facility. She is motivated to improving so that she can return home, and so perceives praise as a promise of return. The conflict arose because of miscommunication between the patient and I. Therefore, I recommend that she be given information on home care options and additional emotional support. I must also always be with a registered nurse present when addressing patients and should reflect on my communication so as to avoid circumstances like this again. Self-care. Due to the empathetic nature of nursing, feelings of sadness can arise from the sights of mourning that surround a nurse, and the constant compassion that is required of nurses can lead to compassion fatigue. Compassion fatigue can impact the quality of patient care, job satisfaction, and retention within nursing, and also lead to depersonalizing patients and becoming withdrawn. Hence, it is imperative that nurses are resilient, reflective, and exercise emotional intelligence, regulating their emotions effectively. Reflection is paramount to self-care because the nurse can identify their coping mechanisms and the self-care strategies that work for them, aiding in personal growth. As first-year students, you may need time and space after your first encounter with a deceased patient, but understanding bereavement and reflecting on grief with the FWHL strategy can help you to cope. In conclusion, it is part of the nurse's duty of care to provide quality person-centered care to patients and their families. You can achieve this by using effective nonverbal communication strategies, focusing on the patient's needs and concerns first, being an active listener, and by exercising self-care. Good luck on your first aged care placements.